Welcome to Angel's Message for You channel now, beautiful soul. If you are here right now, it is not by accident. The angels guided your eyes, your hands, your heart to this exact moment. And they have something so important, so deeply personal, to share with you today. Take a slow breath right now. Feel your shoulders drop. Feel your chest open just a little. Because what you are about to hear has the power to change the way you see everything. Stay with us all the way to the end of this message, because the revelation that comes in the final moments, it may be the one your soul has been waiting for longer than you even realize. Blessings are raining down on you right now, not tomorrow. Right now, in this very second, the angels are surrounding you, above you, beside you, behind you, beneath you, forming a warm circle of golden light that no fear, no doubt, and no darkness can enter. You are loved beyond what words can hold. You are protected in ways you cannot always see. You are seen fully and completely by forces greater than anything this world contains. And today, heaven itself sent a message here, carried on the wings of angels, to speak directly and tenderly into your heart. Something is happening, something real, something that has been quietly building for longer than you know. And the angels have been watching it unfold, patiently, lovingly, waiting for exactly the right moment to bring this truth to you. That moment is now. There is someone out there who thinks about you every single day. Someone who carries your name like a prayer whispered before sleep. Someone who, in this very moment, is looking at an empty space in their home, in their routine, in their heart, and seeing only you. Not as a wish, not as a distant dream, as a destination, as the only answer that ever made real sense. And the angels want you to know with certainty that space has your name woven into every corner of it, and nothing and no one else has ever been able to fill it. Close your eyes for just a moment and imagine this. A home with warm lights glowing soft against the evening. A table set carefully with intention, as if someone is expecting someone important. A heart on the other side of a door, beating fast. Not with anxiety, but with readiness. That heart has made a decision. A quiet one. A deep one. The kind that does not announce itself with fanfare but settles in like roots settling into the earth. That decision has been growing slowly, the way seeds grow underground long before the flower ever shows its face. And that decision, that beautiful, patient, life-changing decision, is about you. Your person, the one the universe has been carefully preparing, the one whose soul is woven into yours in ways that time and distance have never been able to undo, is no longer willing to spend another day living in the emptiness that comes from missing you. They have tried. The angels want you to understand this. They have truly tried to move on. They have stayed busy. They have built routines. They have told themselves stories about why it did not work, why the timing was wrong, why life was pointing somewhere else. They have tried to fill the silence with other conversations, other sounds, other faces, and none of it worked. Not because those other things were bad, but because nothing in this world can replicate or replace the specific feeling that lives in this person's heart when they think of you. You are not just a memory to this person. You are not just a chapter from their past that they occasionally revisit with bittersweet nostalgia. You are the missing piece. You are the answer to a question their heart has been quietly asking for a very, very long time. And today, the angels are saying clearly, gently, joyfully, get ready, because love is finding its way home. And home is you. You may be sitting wherever you are right now, going about your completely ordinary day, not realizing that on the other side of this deep connection, something enormous is quietly, steadily unfolding. Your person is not just thinking about you. They are planning. They are preparing. They are making space, real, tangible, emotional, spiritual space, because they want you in their life for good. Not as a visitor, not as a sometimes, not as a maybe, as the one, as the person who finally makes everything make sense, as the only one who has ever truly felt like home. How often have you felt it? That quiet, unexplainable nudge in the middle of an ordinary afternoon? That sudden wave of warmth or longing that came out of nowhere while you were just doing something simple? That moment when a particular song came on and your whole chest tightened with a feeling you could not put words to? That was not your imagination running wild. That was not just random emotion. That was a signal. That was your person's heart reaching across the space between you, calling to yours without words, speaking in the ancient language that souls use when they recognize each other. The angels want you to fully understand this. Those moments are real. What you felt in those moments was real. The connection that sparked those feelings is real, and it is alive, and it has never truly gone quiet. Your person has been on a journey, a deep, internal, sometimes painful, ultimately beautiful journey. They have sat with questions that had no easy answers. They have wrestled with fear in the dark. They have laid awake in the silence of 3 a.m, wondering if it was too late, wondering if the door was still open, wondering if there was still a chance to choose differently, to choose better, to choose what their heart had always known was right. And through all of that wrestling, through all of that seeking, through all of that trying, one truth kept rising to the surface. One name kept coming back, no matter how many other names they tried to replace it with. One face kept showing up in their most honest moments, in their most unguarded moments, in the moments when the performance of being okay dropped away and only truth remained. And that face was yours. This is not just longing. This is not the kind of nostalgia that fades once you get busy enough or distracted enough. This is something much more durable than that. This is a soul recognizing its home. When someone has genuinely tried every other path and keeps finding themselves circling back to the same person, that is not weakness. That is not lack of willpower. That is the deepest kind of wisdom, the wisdom of the heart, which knows things the mind has not yet caught up to. And your person's heart has finally, fully, irreversibly won the argument. Think about the most beautiful and honest version of love you can imagine. Not the movie version with the perfect lighting and the perfectly timed speeches. The real version. Two people who know each other's actual flaws and choose to stay. Two people who can sit in complete silence together and feel absolutely full. Two people who wake up in the morning and feel genuinely, simply grateful that the other person is there. No performance, no pretending, just the quiet, steady joy of sharing life with the one who feels like belonging. That is what your person is reaching toward. That is what they are building their courage to claim. And they are reaching toward it with you. They dream about the small things, not just the big romantic moments, the small, everyday, completely ordinary things that turn into treasure when you are sharing them with the right person. The smell of coffee drifting through the house in the morning. The sound of your laugh during a conversation about nothing important. Watching something together and glancing at each other at the exact same moment because you both found the same thing funny. Lazy weekend mornings with nowhere to be. Long conversations that wander from one topic to another and somehow always end up somewhere meaningful. The kind of quiet evening where the whole world outside feels far away and everything inside feels like enough. That is what your person aches for. That is the life they are quietly building the courage to ask for. And they can only see that life, that real, warm, ordinary, extraordinary life, as possible if you are in it with them. You might not know this, but this person holds memories of you like something precious. Every shared laugh, every moment of real honesty between you, every time you showed up in a way that surprised them with its gentleness. All of it left a mark, an imprint on the deepest layers of who they are. And even though life may have carried you both down different roads for a while, even though time and circumstance created distance, the feeling never stopped. It just went underground for a season, like those seeds that wait through winter. And now the season is changing. This deep desire your person carries for you, it does not come from loneliness or emptiness or a simple wish for company. It comes from recognition. It comes from having experienced something real and genuine and irreplaceable, and having the clarity to know beyond any doubt that what they found in you is not something that can be manufactured or replicated elsewhere. They see in you something they have not found in anyone else. A connection that reaches past the surface, past the casual, past the comfortable, all the way down to something that touches the soul. It is as if their heart simply knows, without needing permission or explanation, that you are the missing piece that makes everything click into place. That is why every attempt to fill the space with someone or something else has ultimately felt hollow. Not because those other things or people were without value, but because the heart does not accept substitutes when it knows what it is truly looking for. Your person discovered this the hard way by trying, by giving other things a genuine chance. And each time, the same truth surfaced again. It is not the same. Nothing is the same, because you are one of a kind to them, and that is not something that can be explained away or rationalized into silence. There is a space in your person's world, in their home, in their days, in their heart, that has been waiting with quiet patience. Not a desperate, aching wait, but a certain one. The kind of certainty that does not need to announce itself because it simply knows. That space carries your energy, your way of moving through a room, your particular laugh, the specific comfort that comes with you and only you. And no matter how the furniture got rearranged, no matter how many new pictures went on the walls, no matter how many attempts were made to make it look complete, it never fully was, because you were missing from it. And now your person knows it, fully, without the ability to pretend otherwise anymore. While you have been going about your own life, handling your own challenges, walking your own path, something has been quietly unfolding on the other side of this connection. Something you may not have seen evidence of yet, but something the angels have been watching with great care and great joy. Your person is not just thinking about you, they are changing from the inside out, not in a dramatic, visible way, but in the deep, lasting way that matters, the way that sticks. They are letting go of old fears, the ones that made them shut down at the worst moments, the ones that made them pull back when everything inside was screaming to step forward. Those fears came from real wounds, from past experiences that taught them to protect themselves at all costs. And for a while, that protection made sense. But protection has a way of becoming a prison when you hold it too long. Your person has realized they have been protecting themselves not from pain, but from the very love that could heal them. And they are breaking free of that, one quiet, brave decision at a time. They are healing things they carried for too long, looking in the mirror with more honesty than before, sitting with the feelings they used to run from and learning to breathe through them instead of escaping them. All of this inner work, and the angels see it, every single piece of it has a single purpose. It is preparation. It is getting ready to offer you something real, something whole, something that has been refined by time and by truth into the kind of love that lasts. Your person is also rethinking what actually matters. The things they used to chase that left them feeling empty, they are losing their grip. The connections that never really went anywhere, they are being quietly released. There is a new kind of clarity settling in, the kind that comes when someone is done pretending and finally gets honest about what they want. And what they want at the top of the list is you, not as a concept, not as a memory they visit on lonely nights, as a present, living, breathing, daily reality in their actual life. Every thought they have had about you recently, whether they followed it or tried to push it away, has been a step in your direction. Every time a memory surfaced and instead of feeling heavy it felt warm, that was a step. Every small habit they have shifted, every small space they have cleared, every moment they have paused and let themselves imagine what it would feel like to have you near again. All of it is movement. All of it is the slow, beautiful tide of love coming back in. You might wonder sometimes how this is possible, how someone can feel so strongly about you after everything, how love can survive silence and distance and all the things that were left unsaid. Sweet soul, the angels want you to understand this deeply. Real love is not fragile. It does not need constant tending to survive. It does not die just because life gets complicated or because two people lose their way for a season. Real love is more like a fire that goes underground in a drought and comes back stronger when the conditions are right. It does not disappear. It waits, transforms, finds a new form, and it comes back always when it was always meant to come back. This is that moment. This is the conditions changing. This is the underground fire finding its way back to the surface. Heaven is not just watching this unfold. Heaven is actively participating in it. The angels are not observers from a distance here. They are involved. They are moving things, softening hearts at just the right moment, placing the right thoughts in the right minds at the right time, arranging small coincidences that are not really coincidences at all but perfectly designed moments of alignment. The signs you have been noticing, and the angels know you have been noticing them, the repeated images, the names that appear unexpectedly, the songs that play at uncanny moments, the memories that arrive with warmth instead of pain. None of that is random. All of it is communication. All of it is the universe keeping both of your hearts pointed toward each other. Divine timing is not the same as human timing. It does not move according to what feels urgent or convenient. It moves according to what is true and what is ready. And the angels want you to know that right now, things are aligning in ways you cannot fully see but can absolutely feel if you pay attention. Both of you have grown. Both of you have healed. Both of you are more ready now than you have ever been. And when two people are truly ready, the universe does not leave them apart forever. It finds a way to bring them back together. Your guardian angel has been walking beside both of you every single day of this journey. Through the uncertain days and the long nights. Through the moments of doubt and the moments of hope. Through everything that felt like it was pulling you apart and everything that quietly kept pulling you back together. None of it was without purpose. Every lesson had a reason. Every hard season was building something. And now you are on the other side of the building phase, and what is being built is something real and solid and meant to last. In the coming days, stay awake to the small things. The universe speaks in whispers before it speaks in declarations. Could be a message that arrives when you least expect it. A conversation that takes a turn you did not anticipate. An unexpected invitation. A moment where you are in a certain place at a certain time and something inside you lights up and you just know that this is one of those moments. Trust those moments. Do not talk yourself out of them. Do not let fear make them smaller than they are. Take a quick second before we move forward. Many channels are reposting and copying our content, but authentic energy cannot be duplicated. For the strongest positive connection and divine guidance, always listen from the original Angel's Message for You channel with the black logo base. Now, let's continue with the message your angels want you to hear. Your person is working up to something. They are gathering their courage the way someone gathers pieces of a puzzle, one piece at a time, until the picture becomes clear enough to complete. And the angels are saying to you, when they finally take that step, be open. Not naive, not without your own wisdom and your own knowing, but open. Because what is coming toward you is not a trick or a coincidence. It is the answer to prayers you may not have even known you were praying. This is also a message about your own heart, because the angels see you too. They see the hopes you have carried quietly, the moments you allowed yourself to imagine something beautiful and then quickly pulled the thought back, afraid to want too much. The times you protected yourself from being too hopeful because hope sometimes felt dangerous. The ways you have grown through this season of waiting, even when the waiting felt endless. All of that is seen. All of that matters. And none of it was wasted. You are more ready than you know. The version of you that is about to step into this next chapter is not the same version that went through the hard parts. You have been changed by everything you walked through, softened in the right places, strengthened in the right places, more clear about who you are and what you deserve, more willing to receive love than you were before, even if it does not always feel that way. The angels see the readiness in you even when you cannot see it yourself. There is a beautiful kind of love that is worth every moment of the journey toward it. Not the kind of love that asks you to be less than yourself. Not the kind that keeps you guessing or keeps you small. The kind that says, here all of you is welcome. Here you do not have to perform or explain or earn your place. Here your presence is not just tolerated but genuinely celebrated. Here you are home. That is the kind of love that is moving toward you. That is what your person wants to offer. And it is real. They want to share the whole life with you, not just the highlight reel. The whole thing. The ordinary Tuesdays and the hard conversations and the slow Sunday mornings and the moments when everything goes wrong and you figure it out together. They want to be on your team fully and completely for the long haul. They want to know that when the world gets heavy, there is one person they are coming home to. And they want that person to be you. Only you. Always you. The angels are asking you to trust what you feel. Not to override your wisdom, but to honor the deepest knowing that lives underneath the noise of doubt. That knowing has never lied to you. It has been there, steady and quiet, through everything, pointing toward something real. Trust it now more than ever. Trust the connection that never fully went silent no matter how much time passed. Trust the part of you that has always known on some level that this story was not finished. Because it was not. It is not. It is just arriving at the chapter where everything starts to make sense. You are so deeply loved, not just by the person this message is about, but by heaven itself, by every angel who has ever been assigned to walk beside you, by the divine intelligence that wove your soul into existence with intention and purpose. Every single step of your life has been guided, even when you could not feel the guidance. Every turn, even the ones that hurt, was leading you somewhere important. And that somewhere, that beautiful, real, warm somewhere, is a love that is grounded and steady and full of genuine peace. When the moment arrives, and the angels are saying clearly, it is arriving, receive it with your heart open. You have done the work. You have walked the path. You have grown through everything that needed to grow. You are not the same person you were at the beginning of this story. You are fuller. You are wiser. You are more you than you have ever been. And you deserve everything that is coming. You are not too late. You have not missed your chance. The window has not closed. In fact, And the angels want you to really let this land. The window is opening wider right now. With love, with intention, with perfect timing. Stay present in the days ahead. Stay gentle with yourself. Stay rooted in your own peace. Stay open to the unexpected. And more than anything, stay faithful to the truth that lives in the quietest, most honest place inside your heart. That truth is your compass. It always has been, and it is pointing exactly where you are meant to go. You are the home someone has been searching for in all the wrong places until they finally understood they already knew where it was. You are the peace that someone has been missing without being able to name it. You are the one who makes everything click into place in a way nothing else ever could. And the love that has been holding your name quietly, faithfully, patiently, for all this time, is finally ready to speak it out loud. The angels are with you every single step of the way. Not just today, not just in this moment, every day. In the morning when you wake up, in the hard moments when you need strength, in the small, beautiful moments that remind you life is worth living fully. You are never, ever alone. You are always held in a light so vast and so warm and so completely for you that no darkness in this world can touch it. And right now, in this moment, that light is saying one thing with complete and total certainty. Get ready, beautiful soul. Love is coming home, and it has your name on it. End of text. Wait, before you close this out, the angels have one more thing to say, and this part is especially important. Please stay with it, because here is something that does not get talked about enough when people speak about love and connection and spiritual signs. The preparation is not just happening on the other person's side. Heaven has been preparing you too, and the angels want to make sure you understand the fullness of what that means. Think about this past season you have been walking through, the moments of uncertainty, the times you had to choose between staying in fear and choosing faith, the periods when you had to learn to sit with yourself without distraction, without noise, without the constant busyness that so many people use to avoid feeling the deeper things. All of that had purpose, every single bit of it. You were being shaped, refined, made more fully into the person you are meant to be, the person who is ready to receive what is coming. Love like this, real love, requires two whole people. Not two people who are perfectly healed or perfectly sorted out, but two people who are honest. Two people who have done enough inner work to show up with genuine openness. Two people who have been through enough to know what actually matters and what does not. You are that person now. Maybe you do not see it yet from the inside, but the angels do. They see every quiet act of courage you have made when no one was watching. Every time you chose kindness over bitterness. Every time you chose hope over cynicism. Every time you got back up after a hard moment and kept going. Every time you allowed yourself to still believe in something beautiful even when the evidence for it felt thin. That is not small. That is the kind of soul that true love is drawn to, like light is drawn to an open window. And there is something else the angels want you to hear, something deeply personal. You have been carrying something for a long time. Quiet weight, not always painful but present. The feeling of something unresolved, something unfinished, like a conversation that got interrupted before the most important part was said, like a story that ended mid-sentence and you have been waiting, without always realizing you were waiting, for the next line. That waiting is almost over. The feeling you have carried is real. The sense that something important is still coming, still unfolding, still making its way to you. It is accurate. You were not wrong to feel it. You were not imagining things. The angels placed that knowing inside you, like a seed of truth, and they have been watering it with every sign, every synchronicity, every quiet confirmation that something greater is working on your behalf. Now let us talk about what this love actually looks like when it arrives fully. Not just the feeling of it, but what it changes in your everyday life. Imagine waking up and the first thought you have does not carry weight or worry. Carries warmth. Because someone who loves you is nearby, or is thinking of you, or has sent you a message that makes you smile before you have even fully opened your eyes. Imagine going through your day and feeling, underneath everything, a steady and quiet foundation. Not the desperate excitement of something uncertain, but the deep settledness of something true. Imagine having someone to share the small victories with. Not just the big announcements, but the tiny moments. The good parking spot, the beautiful sunset, the funny thing that happened at the store. The small bright beads of everyday life that string together into something rich and meaningful when you have someone to share them with. Imagine not having to explain yourself from scratch to someone. Someone who already knows the important things about who you are. Someone who gets your sense of humor. Someone who has seen you at less than your best and stayed anyway. Someone who does not need you to perform happiness or togetherness. Just someone who wants the real you in the real moments, living the real life. That is what is coming. That is what this person wants to build with you. A real life. An honest, warm, imperfect, beautiful real life where both of you show up as yourselves and find that being yourselves together is more than enough. Your person thinks about this too. The specific version of it. They imagine what it would be like to have you in the regular flow of their days. Not as a guest, but as a permanent presence. They have pictured small things, what it would be like to cook a meal together, what it would feel like to have your voice in the house, what kind of life takes shape when you stop imagining it and start actually living it. These are not idle daydreams. These are the blueprints of a genuine intention. There is also something spiritually significant about the timing of all of this that the angels want to illuminate for you. You may have wondered why things moved slowly. Why, if this connection is so real and so meant to be, it did not come together more quickly or more easily. The answer is not that the universe was being unkind. The answer is that both of you needed to arrive at this moment differently than you arrived at all the earlier moments. You needed to come to this not with urgency or desperation or the kind of grasping that comes from feeling incomplete. You needed to come to it from a place of genuine wholeness, from a place of genuine choice. There is an enormous difference between two people coming together because they cannot stand to be apart and two people coming together because they have genuinely chosen each other with full awareness. The first is beautiful in its intensity but fragile in its foundation. The second is the kind of love that lasts. The kind that has been built on real understanding of who the other person is, real acceptance of their whole self, real willingness to be present not just in the exciting moments but in the ordinary ones. That is what you are both building toward now. Not by forcing it, not by chasing it, but by having become the people who are genuinely ready for it. And the angels want you to feel proud of that. Not proud in an ego kind of way, but proud in the way that someone who has walked a long and sometimes difficult road can feel proud when they finally see the landscape opening up and understand what all the walking was for. The love that is coming to you is not a consolation prize. It is not just something good enough. It is the real thing. The thing that songs are written about and prayers are offered for and people search their whole lives hoping to find. And you are finding it. You have been finding it. It has been there all along, just ripening to the right moment to be fully received. The angels also want to speak directly to any fear you might still be carrying, because it would not be honest to pretend that hope does not sometimes come with fear attached to it. Sometimes the things we want most are the things that scare us the most because they are the things we have the most to lose. If something matters deeply, the thought of it not working out matters deeply too. So if there is fear in you alongside the hope, that is okay. It is human. It is honest. The angels are not asking you to pretend the fear away. They are asking you to let the love be bigger than the fear. Not because the fear is wrong, but because the love is true. And when something is truly true, it is worth taking the risk for. It is worth showing up for. It is worth opening your hands and your heart and letting yourself receive it even. Knowing that receiving means being vulnerable. You have been vulnerable before and survived. More than survived, you have grown. You are stronger and more yourself because of everything you have walked through. And this time, you are not walking into the unknown alone. You are walking in with the angels beside you, with heaven working on your behalf, and with a love that is as real as anything that has ever existed in your life. Trust. That is the word the angels keep coming back to. Trust the process. Trust the timing. Trust the feeling that has never fully left you. Trust the connection that has survived everything it was put through. Trust yourself, your judgment, your knowing, your capacity to love and be loved well. And trust that the universe does not bring two souls this far along the same road without a reason. The reason is beautiful. The reason is you, together, living the life that was always meant for you. One last thing. When the moment of reconnection comes, and it is coming in whatever form it takes, in whatever way it is meant to arrive, do not overthink it. Do not let the mind start running through every possible outcome and every possible way it could go wrong. Just be present. Just be you. Just allow the moment to be what it is, a beginning, a real and honest and long-awaited beginning. Beginnings do not need to be perfect. They just need to be real. And what is coming for you is as real as it gets. The angels are standing with you. They are not going anywhere. They are here in the ordinary moments and the extraordinary ones. In the moments of quiet and in the moments of beautiful chaos. They are here in every sunrise that reminds you that new things begin all the time, in every moment of unexpected joy, in every small sign that whispers, you are on the right path. Keep going, keep your heart open, keep trusting. You are loved beyond measure. You are guided at every step. You are seen fully and held gently by something so much greater than the noise of the daily world. And the love that has been waiting for you, the love that carries your name, that has your face in its dreams, that is even now taking brave steps in your direction. That love is almost at your door. Stay open, stay soft, stay grounded, stay ready. Because what is coming is worth every single moment of the journey that brought you here. The angels love you, and so, from the bottom of every heart that has ever found its way home, welcome to your new beginning. And as you carry this message with you into the rest of your day, remember this one thing above everything else. You did not find this message by chance. You were led here. Something in you was awake enough, open enough, and ready enough to receive what heaven needed you to hear. That says something about you. It says something powerful and good and true. You are someone whose heart is listening. And hearts that listen are hearts that are ready to receive. The love waiting for you honors that. It always has. It always will. Go forward in peace, beautiful soul. The angels walk with you. Heaven is for you. And the best of your story is just getting started. Dear beautiful soul, this angel's message for you channel is a divine space, a sanctuary for the soul. If you're new to this channel, think of this as your spiritual home. It's a sacred space created intentionally for faith to grow, purpose to be sparked, and God-given destinies to be confirmed and lived out. We are busy building a lively community deeply rooted in the rich soil of God's unconditional love. a place where heaven truly speaks into our lives and deep, lasting change regularly happens. We warmly invite you to subscribe and stay connected, because God undoubtedly has so much more to reveal and bring about in your unique life journey. You genuinely don't want to miss what the divine is preparing to do next in and through you. Consider making a generous contribution if you feel moved to support our efforts of spreading divine messages. We invite you to visit our Ko-Fi page. Whether it's $5, $10, $20, or $50, your contribution enables us to continue sharing these profound messages of healing and hope with the world. You can find the link directly in the video description and the pinned comment below. As a special thank you for your kindness, we include the names of our Ko-Fi contributors in our weekly Angels Prayers. We will pray for you by name, asking the angels to help attract love and abundance into your life. Spreading the word is just the beginning of our mission. Hearts are being healed, hope is being renewed, and souls are being guided back to the light. Your support helps us realize our shared goal of making a positive impact. Your generosity, no matter how small, is what keeps our community thriving and bringing people together in love on this sacred journey. We are all interconnected, and we will rise as one. By uniting, we can conquer this. Let us wholeheartedly embrace the abundance that lies ahead. Amen. Amen.